In the trial of Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor, there were 23 witnesses that were called for the Commonwealth, and only 5 of them were cross-examined by the defense. Of these witnesses, only 1 had to be redirected by the prosecution. By comparison, there were also 15 witnesses called by the defense, and only 2 of them were cross-examined by the prosecution with no redirection. In addition, the prosecution called 8 witnesses in rebuttal of the defense, and 2 of them were cross-examined by the defense with no redirection made by the prosecution. Of these 46 witnesses, most gave testimony that seemed to factually help the defense, or had no real bearing on the trial. After studying the transcript, reading and rereading it over and over, it is no wonder that the often told story states that Dr. Taylor was found guilty on circumstantial evidence and the actions involving his rifle taken by 3 jurors. Charles Johnson tells us in his book, A Narrative History of Wise County, Virginia, that, quote, at the time of the Taylor trial, shorthand reporting had not come into popularity and efficiency. So in making the transcript of evidence to be used in an appeal to the State Supreme Court of Appeals, the lawyer would write out an evidence of each witness in narrative style rather than present-day question and answer style. If the lawyers could not agree on the testimony, the judge would write the transcript of the disputed evidence, unquote. What this means is that no questions were recorded in the transcript except the disputed testimony, and in that case, the judge would record the question and answer. This happened only twice in the Taylor trial, as there were only 2 questions recorded in the transcript. One of these occurs in the testimony of Jane Mullins. The question was about how she was able to identify Dr. Taylor during the massacre. Likewise, it is only the testimony of Jane that had to be redirected by the prosecution. This was because Jane Mullins, star witness for the prosecution, was hammered over and over by the defense over statements that she had made shortly after the massacre. In a modern court case, it is the defense attorneys who prepare the brief on which the appeals is made. However, Mr. Johnson's further explanation of the transcript informs us that at the time of the Taylor trial, it was the job of the judge and the county clerk to prepare all appeals. Jane Mullins had disappeared for nearly 4 hours after the massacre, and had given contradictory statements about where she was and what she had done during that time. The testimony about the disappearance is just one of the oddities in the transcripts that makes us believe that the transcript was presented to the Court of Appeals was in fact edited. The record shows that Jane had answered a question about when she had arrived back in the Camden section of President Jenkins, but it appears that there were no follow-up questions to ascertain why it took her over 3 hours to travel 6 miles on horseback. Nor is there any indication that shortly after the massacre there was a search instigated for Jane and her horse. The search for Jane and her horse officially ended at around 6 p.m. when Jane, her horse, and family members arrived on the mountain to retrieve the bodies of the slain, and the questioning of Jane Mullins and her story began. But this is not the only odd occurrence in the testimony of Jane Mullins, which will be further discussed as they occur in the transcript. Again, we want to remind our readers and listeners at the time of the trial there were no questions recorded in the transcript unless the testimony of the witness was in dispute. This happens once in the testimony of Jane Mullins. This means for all the testimony, we and the Court of Appeals are left to our own devices to figure out what the witness was asked that elicited the testimony. A semicolon between the answers is the only clue we are given that the answer to the question had ended and a new question had been asked. However, as we will see, this process was not always followed. Some of the answers appeared to be in response to a multifaceted question or a consolidation of the answers to the multiple questions. In either case, the transcript is easier to follow the more that you are aware of the events leading up to the trial. A luxury that you and we have looked back on the event through hindsight, but one that the Court of Appeals could not and did not have. For ease of understanding, some words were added by us to the transcript. These words appear in italic. We have also separated and marked the sections that appear to be answers to the multifaceted questions or consolidation of the multiple questions and answers with a notation of next question and end of question in parentheses. Other than that, this testimony and transcript are presented word for word as they appear in the narrative history of Wise County, Virginia by Charles A. Johnson. The testimony of Mrs. Jane Mullins, witness for the Commonwealth. The witness testified that she lived in Kentucky, was the widow of Wilson Mullins. Next question. Answer. That she was along when Ira Mullins and the other persons were killed. Next question. Answer. They had got about a half a mile from Pound Gap when the shooting commenced. From the right side of the road and above the road, her husband started to run. End of question. Next question. Answer. He got about 10 or 15 steps when she saw him fall, and she saw one of the horses fall, and went around to it and saw it was shot. She ran to her husband and found that he was shot. End of question. Next question. Answer. She turned him on his side and looked towards where the shooting came from, and then started back to the wagon to see if others were killed. She saw 3 men standing some 20 or 25 steps from the wagon. Mrs. Ira Mullins had got out of the wagon and was under it, and hollered to her to come to her. Witness hollered, quote, "Boys, for the Lord's sake, don't shoot any more. You have killed them all now." Unquote. They replied, quote, "GDU, take to the road and leave or we will kill you." Unquote. She took it to be Dr. Taylor, Heenan, and Calvin Fleming. End of question. Next question. Answer. She recognized them by seeing them. End of question. Next question. Answer. They had green veils over their faces. She recognized Cal Fleming's voice and also thought that she recognized Dr. Taylor's voice. The veils were over their heads and faces. She could see the lower part of their faces. She thought she recognized Martin Benton Taylor. End of question. This is the end of the first round of questioning of Jane Mullins by the young Commonwealth attorney Robert Bruce. As you can see, this transcript, which was on file at the appellate court, would be more informative to us and the appellate judges if some of the questions had been recorded, especially in the questioning of the Commonwealth's, quote, star witness, unquote, Jane Mullins. Cross-examination by Dr. Taylor's defense team. Next question. Answer. On cross-examination, the witness testified that she was riding behind the wagon and that the Mullins and Harris boys were by her side. Wilson Mullins was by the side of the wagon when the shooting commenced. The shooting came from the right-hand side of the road. The parties who did the shooting were behind the rocks or the cliffs. End of question. Next question. Answer. She could see them from the breast up. End of question. Next question. Answer. They spoke 3 or 4 times. She took it to be Cal Fleming who spoke first. End of question. Next question. Answer. She thought 2 voices spoke to her. She got back to Elkhorn about 4 p.m. End of question. Here is the first oddity in the questioning of Jane Mullins. She is clearly asked about her late arrival to the Camden section of present-day Jenkins, Kentucky. However, there are no follow-up questions to ascertain why it took her over 3 hours to ride 6 miles on her return home, a trip that should have taken 15 minutes on a galloping horse. Yet she had not been seen by anyone traveling that day on either side of Pound Mountain. She had not been seen by anyone until she arrived in Camden. In addition, This means that she passed John Bentley's store, Richard Burroughs' survey camp at Sweetwater, John Wright's home, and others without stopping to seek help. This is an important bit of information, as we shall see. The importance lies in the fact that no other questions by the defense are recorded in the transcript about her late arrival. Still, in the re-examination or redirects by the prosecution, a question is asked about her horse. However, no questions about the horse appears in the transcript of the questioning by the defense. Next question. Answer. She was excited about the shooting that was going on. She had known Dr. Taylor for 15 years. She had heard him talk and had stayed overnight with him about 7 or 8 years before. End of question. It is at this point that the defense starts pounding Jane about the contradictory statements she had made prior to being taken into custody as the star witness. Of note here, Jane states that she had stayed overnight with Dr. Taylor. This, more than likely, had to do with the birth of Jane and Wilson's daughter. However, this testimony may have been one of the instances that caused the identity of Jane to become mixed with 2 other women. Jane Mullins, who Dr. Taylor had an affair and child with, her sister Amanda Mullins, and emoted Jane Mullins, the wife of Wilson, sister of Ira, and surviving witness of the Killing Rock. For more information on this, see our video titled, Who is Jane Mullins? Back to the testimony of Jane Mullins. Question. Answer. She did not state at the inquest that she did not know who it was. End of question. Next question. Answer. She did not tell Mrs. Blevins on the day after the killing that she did not know who it was. She did not tell Mr. Bentley that she did not know who it was. End of question. Note here, Mr. Bentley was John Bentley, the magistrate who had conducted the inquest. Next question. Answer. She did not tell Matt Blevins that she did not know who it was. She did not tell the grand jury that they had veils over their faces. She said that she saw part of their faces. Witness said that she had heard Dr. Taylor talk last fall. If she told Mrs. Blevins that she did not know them, she was talking and not swearing. She said that she told several people that she did not know who it was. End of question. Of note here are the veils in question. Jane had told several witnesses that she was only able to see the attackers from the waist to the mouth. From the mouth up, they were wearing dark veils, held in place by a green band of some sort at their foreheads. But she had told the prosecutor that the veils were green. It is by the end of this question or questions that Jane appears to have become rattled by the defense, as we soon shall observe. Next question. Answer. She said that she did not swear before John V. Bentley that she did not know who it was, because he told her that she need not answer that question. She said that she was not point-blank certain that it was Dr. Taylor, but that she thought it was. She thought she could swear positively to a person with their face covered down to the mouth. She said that she did not tell Mrs. Blevins last winter that, quote, "Yonder goes that old devil now, and I would like to see him in the middle of a kettle of torment," unquote. End of question. Here is yet another oddity in the transcript. Even though the testimony alludes to the fact that Magistrate John Bentley and Robert Mullins conducted the investigation at the crime scene, neither the transcript nor the story being told by Charles Johnson confirms that fact. It is in the often told story that we learn that this vital information and the fact that John V. Bentley conducted the inquest. Inquests were conducted to gather as much information about a crime as possible. It is often during the inquest that suspects are named. Yet here Jane testifies that John Bentley told her not to tell him who she thought had committed the crime. This is a statement that contradicts her earlier testimony and makes no sense. Additionally, we learn from the often told story that Henry Adams and James Potter were named as suspects by the inquest due to the circumstantial evidence found at the crime scene. This is corroborated by the fact that Henry Adams turned himself in and was out on bail by the time of the shootout at the breaks of the Cumberland. The inquest was conducted on or about May 19th, and Jane Mullins would have been taken into protective custody on or about May 26th. But Dr. Taylor and the Fleming brothers were not named as suspects until Jane testified before the grand jury on June the 2nd. In either case, it was with the answer that, quote, she said she did not swear before John V. Bentley that she did not know who it was, because he told her that she need not answer that question, unquote. That Jane Mullins, star witness for the prosecution, contradicted her earlier testimony and perjured herself. Therefore, the jury more or less threw out the testimony, and it is recorded in the affidavits that the jury only found Dr. Taylor guilty through the evidence found at the crime scene, the bullet shells, and their examination and alteration of Dr. Taylor's rifle, back to the transcript and the testimony of Jane Mullins. Next question. Answer. She told Calvin and Wesley Swindall that she did not know who it was. She just told them what she wanted to tell them. End of question. Next question. Answer. She was afraid to tell who it was for the fear that they would kill her. She recognized Dr. Taylor mostly by his looks and saw him from the breast up. End of question. Next question. Answer. The recognition of Dr. Taylor was mostly by his looks. End of the defense questions. Re-examination or redirect by Commonwealth Attorney Robert Bruce. Next question. Answer. On re-examination, witness said Bentley, Jarvie Candell, and others told her not to tell who it was. Witness heard that Taylor and the Fleming boys were laying around her house trying to kill her. End of question. Next question. Answer. That she got this information from James Potter. When the firing commenced, her horse threw her and she got off some way. She did not know how. End of question. Here we see the prosecution attempts to save Jane Mullins as a witness. We also see in one of the questions he attempted to recover her testimony about the horse, a line of questioning that makes no sense as the transcript does not record the defense asking a question that would have required this redirect. But there is even a bigger problem here. Jane Mullins answers an unknown question stating that Dr. Taylor and the Flemings were lying in the ambush around her home and that James Potter had told her this. Although Jane could not know this, the prosecution knew that Sarah Blevins would later testify that Jane had told her after the funerals that James Potter, a man whose name repeatedly comes up throughout the story, James Potter told her that Dr. Taylor and the Flemings were the ones who had ambushed her family at the Killing Rock. It is after this devastating testimony and the equally devastating redirect about the horse that the prosecution knew that Jane was now useless as a witness. This is further reflected when the defense once again questions Jane Mullins. Next question. Answer. On the recross-examination, witness further stated that she told what suited her and when it suited her. The witness further stated that she had been brought over here by the officers of the county and that she had been here ever since, in the care of the officers of this county. End of question. End of Jane Mullins' testimony. This concludes the testimony of Jane Mullins. As you can see, not only did Jane perjure herself with a testimony about J.V. Bentley and the inquest, but by this time Jane had become extremely agitated and upset, telling the defense, the court, and the jury that she was in fact a liar. She did this by contradicting her entire testimony by stating that she, quote, told what suited her and when it suited her, unquote. The final note in the testimony of Jane Mullins is a disputed part of Jane's testimony. We know this because it has a recorded question. This means that the question was clarified by the judge with a question of his own. This occurred during the cross-examination by the defense, the transcript reads. The witness was asked how she could recognize Dr. Taylor. She answered that she could see him from the waist up to the place where the veil came. She also said that, at the time they were talking to her, a slight stopping of the firing when the smoke rose so that she could see them. One last note on the question asked by the judge. The only question recorded in the transcripts were those that were asked by the judge. These were supposed to clarify a disputed testimony. But in this case, the question is nearly pointless and clarifies nothing, as the answer is almost verbatim to the rest of the testimony about the veils. This is the only other instance in which someone who is not familiar with the case can garner no information about the importance of this testimony, which includes the appellate court. However, looking back on the case through history and hindsight, we can clarify the testimony. Jane had been asked a question by the defense about the identity of the attackers, and a statement that she had originally made to the May 26th grand jury that had issued the first indictment dated June 3, 1892. That indictment had been quashed and thrown out by the deposition on July 26th. Robert Bruce had then handwritten a new indictment and had Jane Mullins sign it as, quote, witness, unquote. The new grand jury, who had been seated on July 26th, had not heard any testimony before the signing off on the second indictment. The information about the veils is vital to know in this case, but the new grand jury and the appellate court would not have known what we are about to tell you. Jane Mullins had told several people that the men had worn dark veils that came down to their mouths and were held in place by a green band at the forehead. The prosecution had apparently been aware of this and asked a question about it, to which Jane testified, quote, the veils were over their heads and faces, and that, quote, she could see the lower part of their faces, unquote. However, the defense had apparently asked Jane about what she had told to the grand jury on June 3rd about those veils, to which she testified that, quote, she did not tell the grand jury that they had veils over their faces, unquote, and that she had told the grand jury that, quote, she saw part of the faces, unquote. This line of questioning and her answer seems to have rattled Jane. It is as if that she was not aware that the defense would have access to what she had told the grand jury. Looking at this, the testimony that she said that she had made to the grand jury contradicted the testimony that she had just made to the prosecution. This meant that either she had lied to the grand jury, or that she had just lied on the stand to the question asked by the prosecutor, Robert Bruce. We know this because the judge asked a clarifying question, and the defense kept coming back to this line of questioning, as Jane further testifies that, quote, she said she was not point-blank certain that it was Dr. Taylor, but she thought it was. She thought that she could swear positively to the person with the face covered down to the mouth, unquote. And two other times in the testimony she states, quote, she recognized Dr. Taylor mostly by his looks and saw him from the breast up, unquote, and, quote, the recognition was mostly by his looks, unquote. Think about this for a minute. How likely are you to identify someone during a shootout who is trying to kill you when you can only see that person from the waist to the chin area? She had already testified that she was, quote, highly excited, unquote, or more to the point, frightened and fearing for her life. And yet Jane had managed to not only identify one shooter dressed in this fashion, which is highly unlikely, but three shooters in a similar garb in a matter of moments. Jane Mullins had perjured herself at least 3 times. More than any person is why her testimony of Jane Mullins is highly unreliable. As we go through the trial transcript so far, we have seen the case for the Commonwealth of Virginia is not going very well against Dr. Taylor. We have also discovered some abnormalities in the trial transcripts themselves. One of the subtle abnormalities comes from the format of the testimonies of the Swindall brothers and S.T. Smith. Was this change of writing style deliberate or a clue for us to know that at one point the trial transcripts were changed to conceal the cover-up? Come with us as we ponder the possibilities. After the unreliable and disastrous testimony of Jane Mullins, quote, star witness for the prosecution, unquote, something changed. At first, this change might not have come easily to the eye, but with close examination of the transcript, you will notice that there is a strange change in the writing styles at the end of Jane's testimony. At first, this peculiar change in the transcript can easily be overlooked. But after much thought and discussion about what we know about the trial and what Johnson has told us about the trial transcripts, we have concluded that there are two possibilities for this strange and peculiar change. Either the typist that Charles A. Johnson had hired quit, and then Johnson hired someone else to finish the book, or Mr. Johnson and his typist had copied the trial transcripts verbatim, as he previously stated. Then someone else prepared the rest of the trial's transcripts. As this is yet another strange oddity in the trial transcripts, we strongly believe that this change in writing style occurred when the transcript was being prepared by the court in Wise County. At the time, it was customary for the district and circuit court clerks to prepare the appeals, transcripts, and other evidence for the appellate courts. Today, this would be handled by the attorneys of the accused, but at the time of the Taylor trial, the defense would write out the exceptions or writs of error to the trial. The court would then order these exceptions be made part of the trial transcripts. However, in the Taylor trial, we know that there were 12 exceptions that were ordered to be made as part of the record, but these exceptions never made it to the appellate court. What's more is this peculiar change in writing style may yet be an additional evidence that the trial transcripts were edited for content before being sent to the appellate court. The question is, if this change in writing style is evidence of editing, who was the editor? Was it the writer who from the start of the trial transcripts to the testimony of Jane had written in a relaxed and informal manner? Or was it the writer that seems to have reported the rest of the witnesses for the prosecution in a very formal manner? Or could it be evidence of multiple editors? Thus far, each testimony had begun with the phrase, quote, the witness testified, unquote, and went on to the testimony. Now the reporting takes on a formal and official tone, starting with the phrase, quote, the witness testifies as follows, unquote. Each question still ends with a semicolon. In addition, the recorded testimony prior to this change contained a lot of he said and she said statements when the questions were asked. Now those questions are recorded in a more conversational way, the way in which you would expect to hear if you were listening to someone answer questions from someone else. However, the trade-off in this is now the answers all seem to be either multifaceted or a collection of answers to questions along the same line of questioning. The testimony of Doc Swindall, witness for the Commonwealth. The witness testifies as follows, quote, I live at the Pound, and I know Dr. Taylor and Ira Mullins. I live 150 yards from Ira Mullins' house, and I saw him Sunday before he was killed. Dr. M.B. Taylor stayed all night at my house on Saturday night before Ira Mullins was killed, and he asked me about Ira and said that Ira had offered for his life. I was in bed when he came to my house. He asked me to get up and come with him out on the porch, and he wanted to talk to me. He said that sometime after Ira had offered the reward to have him, that's Taylor, killed, someone had shot into his, Ira's, bed. But it, quote, wasn't me, unquote, and laughed. He said there was aiming to come up big trouble, and that the Fleming boys would not bother me and Colonel Swindall any more, and that he had that fixed, unquote. Quote, he asked me if there was anyone I wanted put out of the way, and I said I don't want anyone put out of the way unless it was somebody that wouldn't live under the law. And he said, what about Martin Sowers and Ira Mullins? Martin Sowers and me had some trouble. And I told him I thought Ira Mullins was a very good neighbor, and I don't know much about him, unquote. Quote, He told me to keep Martin Sowers and Ira Mullins located until the trouble came up, that he would be at my house every other night until the trouble came up. I remember saying something about Henry Hall in this connection. Mr. M.B. Taylor left my house before Ira Mullins started to Elkhorn. He said something about Ira's dog being killed. If he had any gun or pistol, I did not see them." Unquote. Greg Swindall came to my house with him. There is a good deal of shooting around Donkey, where Ira Mullins and I live. I did not hear that Ira Mullins' house was shot into until I came to the Wise Courthouse some days afterwards. He said that there was a warrant out for the Fleming boys, and they would not bother me any more. Unquote. This witness was then asked this question. This is what it said, quote, "What trouble he, witness, referred to," unquote. And he answered that he supposed he had referred to the trouble between him, the witness, and the Flemings, when he, Taylor, said, quote, "He had the trouble with the Flemings fixed," unquote. The testimony of Dr. Swindall is very hard to follow. This could simply be because of the change in recording style, or it might be an indication of something else. Swindall testifies about 3 troubles, one that he and Colonel Swindall had with the Fleming brothers. Doc Taylor tells him that one has been fixed. Taylor asks about putting anyone out of the way and asks about Martin Sowers. In his answer, we learn that Swindall also had some trouble with Sowers. The third trouble is the first to be brought up in the testimony, and it has to do with Ira Mullins. This trouble is only testified to by Doc and Greg Swindall. The often told story sometimes says that this trouble had to do with a, quote, "loose woman living in Ira's house," unquote. But whatever this trouble was, Taylor mentions it 3 times to the Swindall brothers. The odd thing about this trouble can be found in the question asked about it by the judge. Taylor had stated that, quote, "there was aiming to come up big trouble," unquote. Taylor then tells Swindall not to worry about the trouble, that he had fixed it with the Flemings because he, Taylor, had fixed it. Taylor then asks Swindall to keep an eye on Sowers, which makes no sense, and Mullins until the trouble comes up. Dr. Taylor also informs Swindall that he plans to come up to his Swindall's house every other night until the trouble came up. If this trouble was Swindall's trouble with the Flemings, it had been fixed. Why was Ira linked to the trouble coming up? Testimony of Craig Swindall, witness for the Commonwealth. The witness testifies as follows, quote, "I live at the Pound. I knew Dr. Taylor. I last saw Dr. Taylor Sunday morning and also saw him Saturday night before. He and I went to Doc Swindall's last night from Clifton Robinson's. We got there about 10 o'clock at night. Dr. Taylor asked Doc Swindall if he wanted anybody put out of the way and asked him about Ira Mullins and Mart Sowers." Unquote. Quote, "He, Taylor, said that there was aiming to come up a big trouble and that he wanted Doc Swindall to keep them until the trouble came up. He said that he would be at Doc Swindall's house every night or every other night that week. He said as we came along that night that Ira Mullins had offered $300 to have him killed. When we got 15 steps of Doc Swindall's house, which was about 15 yards from Ira's house, this was about 10 o'clock at night. I don't know who raised the talk about Ira Mullins, me or Taylor. If Dr. Taylor was armed that night, I could not see any. I did not say anything about Henry Hall that I remember. I'm very forgetful. Don't if I would have remembered it if he had." Unquote. At this point of the trial, we were at first going to end in the in-depth examination of the transcript for the rest of the witnesses for the prosecution. Instead, we're going to do a compilation of the testimony for the rest of the witnesses as apart from 2 of them. They are all going to testify to basically the same type of information about the sightings of Doc Taylor and the Fleming brothers before and after the Pound Gap Massacre. Summary of the testimony of S.T. Smith, witness for the Commonwealth. However, on re-examination of the transcript, we discovered that after the testimony of S.T. Smith, the writing style in the recorded transcript changed once again, and several times thereafter. We felt the need to point this out with the inclusion of Smith's testimony, which occurs before the next change. Smith testifies to very little and once again leaves the reader wondering why the Commonwealth attorney called him as a witness. The only information gained from his testimony is that we discovered that his name is Tom Smith. He is the brother-in-law of Doc Swindall, and he visited Doc Taylor in jail. Taylor asked him if he knew of anything that would help him in this case. Taylor also inquired about Doc Swindall and asked Tom to pass on a message to Swindall. This message was to remember the help that Dr. Taylor had given to Swindall's brother and not to swear to too much against him. We think that this constant change of writing styles throughout the trial transcripts was important enough to bring up again. At this point, we will mention it when it occurs throughout the rest of the trial. We believe that these changes in writing styles are important when looking at the case in hindsight, especially when the lens of hindsight is gained from doing 10 years of research into the contradictions and mysteries which surround the Killing Rock and the Pound Gap Massacre. As we have stated, the format of these testimonies is different from the rest of those that have been previously given. The writing styles will change once again with more testimonies to come. These subtle differences have led us to the question of how accurate these testimonies were recorded for the appellate court, or if they have been changed by Charles A. Johnson himself. We will never know the answer, as Johnson's copy of the trial is the only existing copy available to anyone. This may change, though, through the digitization of records. It is our hope that this will happen and that we can compare the evidence that is currently available. We will discuss the testimonies of Reuben McFall, Granville Cox, and John Branham. Did their testimonies help or hurt the case against Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor? Why was one witness referred to in the testimonies by 3 different names? Was this hidden on purpose? Why was a certain event not asked about in the questioning? We will discuss these issues and many more as we go through the summary of the transcripts recorded by Charles A. Johnson. As we have stated in a previous video, the trial of Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor has not been going well for the Commonwealth attorney, Robert Bruce. 9 witnesses had been called so far, and only one of them had testified to anything helpful to his case. This was, of course, the eyewitness, Jane Mullins. But the problem was that Jane had been rattled and discredited by the defense attorneys. In fact, the defense had been so successful at rattling Jane that her final statement was tantamount to an admission that she had lied on the stand. And with that statement, Jane Mullins had virtually perjured herself as a witness. Prosecutor Bruce would try to prove that animosity existed between Taylor and Mullins with the next 14 witnesses. But none of them would help Bruce to build a case, and he would never firmly establish any other motive for the crime. Most of the next 14 witnesses, like many of the previous witnesses, including Jane herself, would testify to things that would benefit the defense over the prosecution. Of these 14, most simply testified that they had seen Doc Taylor the weekend before and the weekend after the murders. But the next 3 witnesses called by the prosecution, Reuben McFall, Granville Cox, and John Branham, stand out for a couple of reasons. The first witness, Reuben McFall, immediately stands out because, once again, the style of writing changes for the record of his testimony. The writing style changes back for the other 2, but McFall, Cox, and Branham had also participated in the shootout at the cliffs of the Cumberlands. There is no indication of this in the recorded testimony of these 3 men, and we only learn about it after the testimony and cross-examination of defense witness Mrs. Clifton Robertson. In her testimony, she identifies Reuben McFall as Rube McFall. and on cross-examination she acknowledges that she had heard that McFall was a deputy after the incident she testifies about. The testimony she gives is so damning that McFall would be recalled for the rebuttal. But in that rebuttal, the name recorded in the transcript is R. D. McFall, and he identifies himself as deputy sheriff during that incident. Although this name change is subtle and seemingly insignificant, there is nothing recorded in the transcript that would give the appellate court a clue that a single witness from the trial had been identified under 3 different names in the transcript. And without noticing the change in the writing style recorded here in the transcript, we would have missed it too. However, because of this change in writing style and our intimacy with the different versions of the often told story, we were able to link all 3 names together and closely examine his 2 given testimonies, as well as what Mrs. Robinson had testified to about him and the posse. But it was his testimony as recorded at this point in the transcript. And what seems to have been omitted from that testimony has convinced us, more than anything, that this transcript, the one that was sent to the appellate court, was edited for content. Testimony of Reuben McFall, witness for the Commonwealth. McFall testifies here that he had worked with Taylor as a paid deputy in the Internal Revenue Service. He goes on to testify that Dr. Taylor had asked him on several occasions to go with him to kill Ira and Henderson Mullins. He then insinuated that Doc had once told him that he had gone once by himself and, quote, put a man out of the way, unquote. Then he states that Taylor told him that if no one would go with him, he would go by himself. On cross-examination, Reuben McFall would admit that these conversations had occurred more than 2 years prior to the Killing Rock Massacre. He then testifies about when and where the conversations occurred and who had been the witnesses to those conversations. The interesting thing here is McFall did not mention that Granville Cox had been present in any of those conversations. Yet Cox would testify that McFall had been present in a conversation about the same thing. McFall would finish his testimony by telling the court that he had quit working for Dr. Taylor because of a dispute over pay. As we have already stated, the change in writing style for the testimony of Reuben McFall brings attention to what is not recorded here in his testimony or anywhere else in the transcript. Newspaper articles from around June 9th tell us that the Fleming brothers and Dr. Taylor had sent word to Sheriff Holbrook telling them where they were. This would in fact be the first of 3 such letters. In this letter they would state that they, quote, fear for their lives, unquote, and ask for an escort to the Wise County Courthouse in Gladeville, Virginia, and that they would come peaceable with the condition that they were allowed to turn state's evidence. Sheriff Holbrook replies to the letter by telling the newspapers that he is too busy to be bothered with an escort at the time, but on July 17th, Sheriff Holbrook did send one of his deputies and about 20 men to the cliffs of the Cumberlands to arrest Dr. Taylor and the Fleming brothers. The newspapers from the time record this incident and call it the, quote, a botched arrest attempt and shootout, unquote. By the time of Taylor's trial, this, quote, botched arrest attempt and shootout, unquote, was well known. The fact that Reuben McFall had been the deputy that had led the party sent to arrest Taylor would also have been well known by both the prosecution and the defense. Yet, we are led to believe that there is no testimony to this fact at this point in the trial, or recorded here in the transcript. This is highly improbable. To be fair, when the writing style changes back for the testimony of Granville Cox and John Branham, the fact that they were in the McFall posse is also not recorded. However, neither of these men were listed as deputies, and the fact that they were in the posse may not have been known to the defense, something that we learned from the later testimony of defense witness Mrs. Clifton Robertson. Testimony of Granville Cox, witness for the Commonwealth. Granville Cox, like McFall, would testify that Taylor had tried several times to get him to go to Kentucky with him to kill Ira and Henderson Mullins. Cox also testifies that on, quote, one occasion, Taylor had his provisional poke made and told him, quote, if the boys do not come with me and help me, I will go myself, unquote. Granville tells the court that Taylor had wanted him and the boys to, quote, go and help clean up the head of Elkhorn, unquote, and stated, quote, if I don't get it done this year, I will do it next year or have it done, unquote. On cross-examination, Cox, just like Reuben McFall, admits that these conversations had occurred more than 2 years ago. He also admits that the time that he had been working with Dr. Taylor as a paid revenue deputy. Then there is a very peculiar statement in the transcript. Granville is recorded as saying, quote, I had no thought at the time that Taylor meant what he said. I thought it was all talk, unquote. This is very odd, as the testimony would be considered a, quote, judgment statement, unquote, made by the witness. Usually, something like this would have been an item of objection and stricken from the court record. Yet, here it is. If this was an overruled objection, then it was probably one of 12 exceptions to the trial. We need to point out once again that we have a record saying that these 12 exceptions were made part of the court record and attached to the appeal. But when Charles Johnson obtained the, quote, only existing transcript of the trial, unquote, from the appellate court, the only thing attached to it was the indictment, which for various reasons we believe had been altered before it was sent to the higher court, and the 4 affidavits about Taylor's rifle. Granville Cox would go on to testify that, quote, he and Dr. Taylor were not on good terms, unquote. We must pause here to point out another issue with the testimonies of Reuben McFall and Granville Cox. Both attest that the testimonies they had given about Taylor talking about the killing of Ira and Henderson Mullins had occurred over 2 years prior. A later witness for the Commonwealth testifies about being with Taylor when the news came from North Carolina saying that Ira Mullins had been killed in a shootout with revenue agents 2 years ago in 1890. This was, of course, the shootout that had left Ira Mullins a quadriplegic. Other witnesses, both for the prosecution and defense, will testify that Taylor had made no threats against Mullins since the unfortunate incident. But several will testify that Ira Mullins had made several threats against Taylor and that Mullins had offered $300 to anyone who would kill Dr. Taylor. Testimony of John Branham, witness for the Commonwealth. John Branham was the third and final member of the Reuben McFall's posse to testify in the trial. Branham's testimony is a little strange and confusing given the testimony that would later be given about him. He testifies that he had seen Taylor on Thursday after the massacre. What he testifies about could only be seen as a semi-friendly conversation. They had spoken about the ambush and who was being accused of the crime both in Virginia and Kentucky. Branham would also give testimony that Dr. Taylor had told him that he was on his way to the courthouse. Taylor had said that he was to meet Doc Mullins there and that Mullins was going to swear out an affidavit about Ira Mullins offering money to anyone who would kill him, meaning Taylor. Taylor had also told Branham that, quote, he could prove directly where he was on that day, unquote. Taylor had gone on to tell him that he had been, quote, waiting on some sick folks on the other side in Kentucky, unquote. A defense witness corroborates this story by telling the court that Taylor had been staying at her house for a month because her daughter was having a hard pregnancy. Her testimony gives the impression that the child had been born that night. This means at the time of the massacre, her daughter may have been in labor and Taylor had been in attendance with her. There are also other possibilities. We know that the Adams family had been racked with an outbreak of typhoid. In addition, other witnesses testify about Dr. Taylor staying with Ellen Alley during that time and seeking him out for treatment for other sick individuals. There is also a letter. Unfortunately, this letter was sent anonymously, but it was sent to Nancy Booth Taylor shortly after the death of Dr. Taylor. In it, a woman says that she and her husband had been met by someone near the Pound Gap. They had been on their way to Gladeville, Virginia to testify in the Taylor trial, as he had been waiting on her that day of the massacre. They were threatened and told to return home. She was writing to the widow Taylor to give her condolences and to apologize because she and her husband were not able to testify on Dr. Taylor's behalf. John Branham would end his testimony with another odd statement. Branham would say of Taylor, quote, "I do not think he seems exactly natural, as he seemed to talk a little lower than common." Unquote. What Branham meant to say by this statement is unclear. Was he saying that Doc had spoken in a very deep voice? Or is there a typo here? And it should read that Taylor spoke a little slower than other people. We will probably never know. We begin wrapping up the testimonies and evidence of the Commonwealth of the State of Virginia versus Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor. We will be discussing the evidence so far as well as the witnesses on the stand, including John Venters. As we take a closer look, we once again see strange things in his testimony. With the next 11 witnesses, prosecuting attorney Robert Bruce would finish presenting his case. These witnesses, like the preceding 12, testifies to nothing that would help him or build that case, especially when we look at the transcript through the lens of hindsight. However, we must keep in mind that the appellate court would not have that hindsight. They may have read about the case in the newspapers, but not all of the newspaper stories and articles from the time directly identify that they are reporting on the events relating to the, quote, Pound Gap Massacre, unquote. Therefore, there was no way that the judges on the court would be familiar with the case as we are today. As we have previously stated in our other videos and articles, only one of the 23 witnesses that had testified to anything useful for the prosecutor, Bruce, and that had been his star witness, Jane Mullins. But the problem with Jane's testimony is that she had been shaken, rattled, and discredited by the defense. This, along with the fact that she had perjured herself, is plainly recorded in the transcript. And no amount of editing, which we are sure did happen, could hide this from the appellate court. Keep in mind that the often told story and one of these affidavits attached to the transcript tells us that, quote, the verdict of guilt was based solely upon the examination of the rifle by the jury, unquote. An examination in which 3 of the jurors took it upon themselves to disassemble and alter the said rifle. We also know from the affidavits of Sheriff Holbrook and his gunsmith deputy that a piece of the rifle had been removed and that the plunger of the rifle was now in the gun in a way that the gunsmith had never seen before. We know from the testimony given by witnesses from the prosecution and the defense that the rifle was in good working order prior to it being entered into evidence, which only occurred as the defense was wrapping up their case. We know from the often told story that when the rifle was, quote, dry-fired, unquote, using one of the shell casings found at the crime scene, that the plunger or firing pin struck the shell, quote, just off center, unquote. This is corroborated by the affidavit submitted by I.N. Mills. Mills had been one of the jurors, and the purpose of his affidavit seems to be to let the court know that the only reason that he and the other jurors returned a guilty verdict was because of the examination, disassembly, and alteration of the rifle by 3 other jurors. We are grateful to Mr. Mills for his affidavit and honesty. Without his affidavit and the confirmation that the shell casings found at the crime scene were in fact rimfire could not be established. This corroboration confirms that those shell casings were not centerfire 45 by 75, but were in fact from a 44 by 40 rimfire rifle. Lastly, we are grateful to Mr. Mills for one other thing. It is his affidavit and the fact that the 12 exceptions to the trial were not attached to the transcript. That led us to believe that the transcript may have been altered. This prompted us to take a closer look at the transcript, and when we did, we noticed that the transcript was full of anomalies. Witnesses for the Commonwealth of Virginia: William Bud Gillum, his son, Milburn Gillum, and Joe Perkins. In the interest of time and the fact that the majority of the next 11 witnesses testifies to the same thing, we will be giving summaries of these testimonies apart from the testimonies of John Venters, W.B. Winfro, and William Mullins. William Bud Gillum and his son, Milburn Gillum, and Joe Perkins all give testimony about seeing Dr. Taylor on Tuesday before the massacre. They each give testimony that Dr. Taylor had told them that Ira had offered $200 to Doc Mullins to kill him. The testimonies seem to corroborate part of the testimony of John Branham. Branham had just testified that on the Thursday after the killings, Taylor had been on the way to the Wise courthouse to meet Doc Mullins, and that Taylor had told him that Doc was going to swear out an affidavit that Ira had tried to hire him to assassinate Taylor. But if such an affidavit exists, we have not been able to find it. If anyone watching or reading this finds such a document, please let us know as soon as possible. The Gillums and Mr. Perkins give further testimony about this meeting, saying that they had talked about the shooting into Ira's bed at the Mullins cabin, which had occurred in mid-April. William had asked how Taylor had known about the shooting, as he, Taylor, had told them that he had been in Kentucky at that time. Taylor had said that, quote, the spirits had told him, unquote, and made a jab at William when he had asked why the spirits didn't talk to him. Testimony was given by Milburn and Joe Perkins that William had walked off after the jab, but they each further testifies that Taylor had said that, quote, it looked pretty hard for a man to lose his life and his money too, unquote. Witnesses for the Commonwealth of Virginia: May Branham and Logan Nottingham. May Branham would testify before the massacre she had never seen Dr. Taylor and both Fleming brothers together. Both she and Logan Nottingham testify seeing 2 men riding toward Kentucky and the Pound Gap on the Sunday before the killings. Both testify that this sighting had occurred between 10 and midnight. Branham testifies that the men had been Taylor and Cal Fleming, while Nottingham had only identified Taylor. Branham further testifies that she had seen Taylor on Thursday after the massacre going towards Pound. This also corroborates part of John Branham's testimony. She goes on to say that Dr. Taylor and Cal Fleming had come to her house sometime after that. She says that both men were armed, but neither of them had talked about the killing. Witness for the Commonwealth of Virginia: George E. Robertson. George E. Robertson would testify that he had seen Dr. Taylor at his house 2 weeks before the massacre. He would also testify that he had seen Taylor with the Flemings several times after the massacre. He would say that Taylor had been staying with Aunt Ellen Alley during that time in question. This corroborates her and others' later testimony to the same thing. Robertson would go on to say that Taylor had come to his house several times after the killings, sometimes with and sometimes without the Fleming brothers. He also gives testimony to the fact that Dr. Taylor sometimes carried a heavy Winchester rifle. George would end his testimony stating that he had never heard Taylor make any declarations about the killing of Mullins. The testimony of John Venters is another one that draws our attention because of the writing style in the transcript changes once again. What exactly might have been changed in his testimony, other than the rifle, is anyone's guess. Testimony of John Venters, witness for the Commonwealth. Venters would testify that he had heard about the massacre, but within 10 days he, Venters, had sought out Taylor. He states that Taylor had been at the widow Vanover's on Elkhorn Creek, and he had sought him out due to a sick child. We must pause here for just a moment. By the time that Venters would go and ask Taylor to come see his sick child, rumors had been flying for days that Taylor, Adams, and the Flemings were all perpetrators in the ambush and massacre. One would think this is strange. Why seek out a suspected murderer to treat your sick child? What's more is the fact that with every witness, both for the Commonwealth and the defense, would never describe Dr. Taylor or the Fleming brothers as behaving like men on the run. As soon as we learned with the first witness for the defense, these rumors would come from none other than Jane Mullins. We will also learn that Jane had been told by James Potter that Taylor and the Flemings had been the ambushers. But the one thing that is crystal clear from all these testimonies is that nobody who knew Dr. Taylor believed those rumors. And neither did they believe what Jane Mullins had said about the ambush. Venters would then be asked about Dr. Taylor's rifle, and the way in which the rifle is described here is unique. Every other time the rifle is said to be a 45 by 75 using only numbers. But here the phrase is spelled out as a 45-75 using no numbers. He would also be asked about the guns that the Fleming brothers had been carrying. The answer he gives about them is recorded in the same fashion. Venters goes on to tell the court that a few days later he had called Dr. Taylor back to his house to see a child once again. Another interesting thing here is that by the time of the callback, Jane Mullins would have been in protective custody. It is also possible that when Taylor and the Flemings came to his house for the second time to see the child, that the indictment for Adams, Taylor, and the Flemings may have already been issued. So, we must ask ourselves, quote, are these the actions of a guilty man on the run, unquote, or is it an example of a compassionate and caring man concerned about the welfare of a sick individual? Before answering those questions, remember that within a few days, Adams would go to Wise and turn himself in. Also, keep in mind that around this time, Taylor and the Fleming brothers would begin sending letters to the sheriff of Wise County asking for an escort so that they could turn themselves in. Cross-examination of John Venters. On cross-examination, Venters would testify that he had known Taylor for about 15 years and that Taylor had been carrying a gun for the last 4 to 5 of them. That time frame fits with Taylor becoming a U.S. Marshal. It is also worthy to note that the last duties of Dr. Taylor performed before resigning as a Marshal was to go to Memphis, Tennessee, and return Todd Hall to Wise, Virginia. Taylor would then serve as a jailhouse guard during the time of the trial of Todd Hall. That trial ended in February 1892, so the rumors about Taylor leaving the trial to prepare for the Pound Gap Massacre are easily dismissed. which makes us wonder why Charles Johnson included it in his book. Venters testifies that although Doc Taylor had been carrying his guns for 4 to 5 years, he would sometimes see him without a gun, but states that whenever he met Taylor on the road, he was usually armed. The last few things in the transcript that John Venters testifies about is highly suspect. It is recorded that he said that Henry Adams had a 44 by 75 Winchester, a gun that did not exist. He goes on to testify that he thought James Potter and Howard Little also owned guns of the same make and model. Another interesting thing here is that the often told story tells us that Henry Adams and James Potter had been named as suspects during the inquest because it was known that they owned the guns that matched the shell casings found at the crime scene. Curiously, John Venters is asked where Adams and Little lived, but is not asked about James Potter. As we have said in other videos, the name of James Potter is brought up over and over throughout this story. But for some reason, he is not indicted, nor is he subpoenaed, or is he to testify in this trial. Venters then testifies that Enos Hamilton owned a 45 by 75 and lived in Virginia. He then finishes his testimony by telling the court that Calvin and Heenan Fleming lived on the widow Vanover's land in Kentucky on the Elkhorn Creek. As we wrap up the Commonwealth of Virginia's prosecution case against Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor, the defense gets set to put on their case. In our last video, we covered and summarized the testimonies of William Bud Gillum, his son Milburn Gillum, and Joe Perkins. These 3 men all testified to a conversation the 3 had with Taylor a week before the killings. The men testified that they had talked about a shooting in the bed of Ira Mullins. This event had happened on April 4th, and Taylor had told them he knew all about it, even though he had been in Kentucky at that time. When asked about how he knew, Taylor had replied, "The spirits had told him." But Dr. Taylor had also told him that Ira Mullins had offered $200 to Doc Mullins to kill him. These testimonies seem to corroborate the testimony of John Branham, who testified that on Thursday after the killings, Taylor had been on the way to Wise Courthouse to meet Doc Mullins, and that Taylor had told him that Doc was going to swear out an affidavit that Ira had tried to hire him to assassinate Taylor. The Commonwealth of Virginia's prosecution witnesses in summary. We also summarized the testimonies of May Branham, Logan Nottingham, and George E. Robertson. May and Logan had given testimony that on the Sunday night before the massacre, they had seen Dr. Taylor and another man, who May identified as Cal Fleming, riding towards the Pound Gap in Kentucky. May Branham further testifies that she seen Taylor on Thursday after the massacre going towards Pound, which also corroborates John Branham's testimony. She goes on to say that Dr. Taylor and Cal Fleming had come to her house sometime after that, but neither of them had talked about the killings. George E. Robertson would testify that he had seen Dr. Taylor at his house 2 weeks before the massacre. He would say that Taylor had been staying with Aunt Ellen Alley during that time in question, which corroborates her later testimony of the same thing. Robertson would go on to say that Taylor had come to his house several times after the killings. George would end his testimony by stating that he had never heard Taylor make any declarations about killing Mullins. Also, in our last video, we summarized the testimony of John Venters, but we went into a little more detail on his testimony because of the changes in recording style in the transcript that we believe indicates that it may have been edited. Venters would testify that on about May 24th, he had sought out Dr. Taylor to treat a sick child. and that he had done so even though he had heard about the massacre. And by that time he had probably heard the rumors about Taylor as well. John then testifies that Dr. Taylor had returned to his house to see the sick child several days later. It is here that the transcript records the most unique testimony about Dr. Taylor's rifle. Every other time the rifle is said to be a 45 by 75 using only numbers. But here the phrase is spelled out as 45-75 using no numbers. He would also be asked about the guns that the Fleming brothers had been carrying. The answer he gives about them is recorded in the same fashion. The abnormality of Venter's testimony for the prosecution. We freely admit in the transcript's prosecution examination phase of the testimony of John Venters, we could find no evidence of editing. But there are several abnormalities that stand out during the cross-examination by the defense. Bear in mind that Taylor's rifle had not yet been entered into evidence. Venters is asked by the defense about a type of rifle and who owns one. He replies that Henry Adams, James Potter, and Howard Little owned a 44 by 75 rifle. At the time of the trial, this rifle did not exist, but the 1873 44 by 40 rifle did exist in both rimfire and centerfire models. We know from the often told tale that the affidavit of I.N. Mills that the ammunition found at the crime scene was indeed a rimfire version of the 44 caliber rifle. This ammunition would indeed fit Dr. Taylor's rifle, but it would have to be hand-loaded and would have struck the shell just off center, again as we are told by the often told story and the affidavit of Mr. Mills. Therefore, in this instance, we think that the cross-examination of John Venters has been altered. We think that the 44 by 40 was changed to 44 by 45. We also found it highly suspicious that Mr. Venters was asked where everyone he named was owning a similar rifle lived, except for James Potter, a man whose name appears over and over in this trial and in the oft-told story. The testimonies of Fillmore Addington and John B. Mullins. Fillmore Addington would testify that on the Friday after the massacre, he would see Dr. Taylor talking with his neighbor, Whit Marshall. He states that the Fleming brothers had been with him and that they had come through the woods and spoken with Marshall by his fence. The next is a little confusing, as Addington states that when he saw Taylor talking to Marshall the next week, Taylor had said not to talk too loud. Addington finishes up his testimony by stating that before the killing, he had never heard Taylor make any declarations against Ira Mullins. John B. Mullins would testify about a conversation he had with Taylor in March of that year. They had been talking about a recent shooting that had happened at Bow Camp in Powell, Virginia. He goes on to say that Taylor said, quote, "It was nothing that would be," unquote. He said that Taylor had said, quote, that they had moved over to the pound and he looked to be killed every day, unquote. Mullins would go on to testify that Taylor had not said anything about Ira Mullins, but he, Mullins, thought that Ira had just moved to the pound. Mullins would then testify that the shooting that they had talked about at the time was, quote, just in fun, unquote, and that Ed Hall, a deputy sheriff, had just moved to the pound. The testimony of W. B. Renfro. The testimony of W. B. Renfro is unique for three reasons. He was a deputy sheriff after Taylor's arrest. He and another deputy had brought Dr. Taylor back to Gladeville to stand trial. He was the first witness to testify to the whereabouts of Dr. Taylor's rifle. Although R.M. and D.O. Baldwin would identify Dr. Taylor in Bluefield, West Virginia, they could not make an arrest. This was because, although an indictment had been issued, there was no warrant for his arrest. The Baldwins had then notified the sheriff of Giles County, Virginia, of Taylor's presence. The sheriff of Giles County responded by sending Deputy Moonshine to Bluefield. Mouchon arrived just as Taylor was boarding a southbound train heading back into Virginia. Mouchon and the Baldwins boarded the same train and kept Taylor under surveillance until they arrived in Pearisburg, Virginia. Deputy Mouchon then arrested Taylor and held him until an arrest warrant could be obtained from a judge in Giles County. Taylor was then remanded into custody of the Baldwins, who boarded another train heading to Norton, Virginia. Taylor and one of the Baldwins would exit the train in Tazewell, Virginia, while the other Baldwin continued to Wise County to collect a private bounty that had been offered for Taylor's arrest. We have no idea who issued the bounty, how much it was, or if it was ever paid to the Baldwin Detective Agency. Deputy Renfro testified that he had not seen Dr. Taylor after the killing, but that he and Deputy White had been sent to Tazewell to bring Taylor back to Wise County. This testimony dispels the rumor about an arrest in Norton or that the Baldwins had returned him to Norton. Renfro testifies that Dr. Taylor had told them that if he had not been caught, he would have been in Florida that day. Renfro is then asked something about a gun. When Taylor was arrested, he had had his twin Colt .45 pistols. But Hilton responds by telling the court that he thought that the jail guard, George Hilton, was using a .45 by .75, and he had thought that that rifle belonged to Dr. Taylor. At this point, we must point out that the rifle was not part of the evidence in this case, and that it would not be entered into evidence until the last witness for the defense testifies that he had shot the gun during the trial. The testimony of William Mullins. William Mullins would be the final witness that Prosecutor Bruce would call to the stand while trying to build his case. His testimony is hard to follow and once again highlights the disadvantages that we and the appellate court would have by not knowing exactly what the witness was asked. But we shall try to make sense of the testimony. Mullins stated that Dr. Taylor had said, quote, "If I ever get in a row with another wagon, I'll shoot the horses first, and I'll get what is in that wagon," unquote. Mullins then says that Taylor had not stated who he was talking about, but he thought it had to do with the shootout that Dr. Taylor and Ira Mullins had in Gladeville. Another note here is that it's probably this testimony where the folk tale about this shootout being the one that had left Ira a quadriplegic comes from. William goes on to testify that Jarvie Candale had given him a message to give to Dr. Taylor. The message is that Ira and Henderson Mullins, along with someone named Palter, had gone to North Carolina for a load of whiskey. To unscramble this testimony, we think that the conversation and the statement about the shooting of the horses was a result of the message from Candale. William Mullins would further testify that Candale had also said that Candale would let Taylor know when Mullins' party would return from North Carolina with the whiskey. William would go on to state that Taylor had not told him if he would try to catch Ira and Henderson, but would say that he saw Taylor later and that at the time Taylor had told him that he had seen Jarvie Candale. William goes on to say that Taylor had said that he and Jeff Mullins had watched Mullins' house in Kentucky day and night, waiting for Ira and Henderson to return. On cross-examination, William Mullins would testify that Dr. Taylor was a United States Marshal at the time when he carried the message from Jarvie Candale. He would also testify that he was with Dr. Taylor when the news came from North Carolina that Ira Mullins had been killed. William testified that when the news had come, that Dr. Taylor had said, quote, "Thank God for that. I was never as glad of anything in my life," unquote. William Mullins would finish up his testimony by admitting that this conversation had taken place nearly 2 years prior. He would also state that Ira had a reputation for dealing in liquor prior to now, and that some people had said that Ira had a U.S. license to do so. The prosecution for the Commonwealth of Virginia now rests its case. The defense team for Dr. Taylor will now put on its witnesses in our next section of the story. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our series on the Killing Rock. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive a notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. We remind everyone that the story names Killing Rock, the Oft-Told Tale, Killing Rock, the Untold Story, and Killing Rock, the Trial are all under the Kentucky Tennessee Living copyrights.